Okay, so Ahmed actually already gave a great bio and introduction to me and what it is that I do, so I'm going to skip over this. So thank you so much. So for today, in terms of what we're talking about, the purpose of this is just to get a really high-level introduction into what some of the key quality requirements are for medical device companies based on ISO 1345 and the FDA requirements. I've tied a lot of that together, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and understand that this is by no means a comprehensive review of all of our quality system requirements. It's not intended to be a substitute for your company's quality team or your SOPs. So this is really an introduction into some of sort of the key sections. And what I want to do is not just talk about what strictly the requirements are, because that's a little dry and that takes about 3 days. There's a lot of training sessions directly on that, but I actually want to talk about like why they are important and why some of them exist, and how they can help you and your company not just meet quality requirements, because that's a thing that us as medtech companies have to do, but actually how they can help you drive improvements into your processes and as a company become more efficient and more effective with how your resources are managed. So I'm going to go through all of those things. And I'm going to do that in kind of the following manner. I'm going to talk about what the basics of a QMS are. I know that there's some people on this call that are very well versed and are quality professionals and understand all of the key responsibilities of a QMS, but there are others that are not. And so this will kind of create just a little bit of a foundation in terms of understanding. And I'm going to talk about the responsibilities in terms of managing and creating and implementing a QMS. And then I'm going to talk about some of the key requirements from just a couple of high-level sections. So design and development, as well as manufacturing, and then just a couple of key sort of general overarching requirements. Like I said, this is not all of the requirements or even all of the sections of ISO 1345, which is the medical device quality management standard. But it is a high level overview of these sections. So just really, really basic. Why do we even have quality management systems? Why do QMSs even exist? And the primary goal is to really just make sure that as a medical device, you're not hurting anyone. You're not hurting your patients, you're not hurting your users, which may be your patients, it may be a clinician, it may be another hospital employee who's interacting with it or caregiver. That's really the primary goal. All of these rules have come about by regulators and quality standard organizations because businesses have made decisions that have led to patients getting hurt. And really, as businesses find more loopholes or mistakes get made, regulators find ways to close those loopholes and more regulations come to play. So it's kind of this cyclical process, and that's how we get changes to regulations. But the end goal of what we're really trying to do is not hurt anybody. Don't injure anybody, don't misdiagnose, don't mistreat, don't treat for the wrong thing. All of those things come down to patient harm or user harm, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So for those of you familiar with QMSs, when you're thinking about like the nitty-gritty of things, why certain documents exist or not, it all comes back down to that specific goal. The second thing is, if you do hurt someone, be able to respond quickly. And so what I mean by respond quickly is you need to be able to respond to that patient. You need to be able to notify regulatory authorities that an adverse event has occurred. And you also need to figure out what that means for that specific product that caused that injury in the field, as well as any other products that could have been made that could also cause that injury, because it could be related to all of your products. It could be related to a specific batch or a specific component or a specific design change that came into play. So that's where a lot of the QMS really traces down into, is how do you get that ability to go back and find what other patients could be hurt or damaged, or and how do you pull all of that together, and then how do you prevent it from happening again? those are really the primary goals. And quite honestly, those are really what the FDA and Health Canada care about. The secondary goal of a good QMS is to have efficient business operations. So what I mean by it being a secondary goal is, quite frankly, the FDA doesn't care if you waste way too much money or spend too much money and burn through all of your funding just to get a single product out the door. What they only care about is that single product, that one piece of equipment is safe for use. But what they will be worried about is if you try and build 100 and you only get one good one, then they'll be really concerned as to, well, did that one just slip through the cracks, or is it actually good for you? So it does kind of tie together. They're not really concerned with how you spend your money, how you spend your resources. Are you selling this at the right price point? Those types of things and how that ties together. They're really concerned about patient and user safety. Okay. So if we talk about, what does that mean for what is a QMS? And for people who haven't seen one, this is just an introduction. And it's basically saying a quality management system is a set of documented procedures, so SOPs, as many of you will have heard, that are used to meet quality standards and regulatory requirements. And in the medical device industry, the same set of standards govern all medical devices. So whether you are a class 1 Band-Aid or you are a class 3 pacemaker, you have the same set of regulations that you need to follow. And that's where each company comes into play in determining the extent of controls that you need for your specific product's risk. So a pacemaker should have more controls than a Band-Aid or a syringe. And that's important to define and document what those controls are and the extent of them, and that falls into your QMS. So what you'll end up doing is you'll end up having a set of SOPs that are defined processes, and they'll tell you what needs to be done and when. They'll tell you who needs to do it, and they'll tell you where evidence of completion needs to be stored. That's the key requirements of an SOP. They may or may not tell you how to go about doing it. And that is dependent on, a lot of times, company size and scale. So in my past experience, when I worked at a company and we were about 8 people, the SOPs covered the first 3, the what, who, where, the when, those first 3 bullet points, but they didn't cover the how. And that worked fine for us because we were small, there was only a couple of people doing the work. As we scaled up, and we had more people doing the work, we found that our SOPs just weren't sufficient because they didn't tell you how to do it. So they still met the quality requirements from a paper perspective, but now people were making decisions independently and doing things incorrectly. So that actually ended up creating non-compliance with the actual quality system or the quality standards. And so that's when we started implementing how to do something within the SOPs itself to control that and to maintain compliance. Okay, so let's talk about just the responsibilities in creating a QMS. There's the external parties. These are the people external to a company who are actually setting the standards and the regulations. They're the ones following and understanding the market. They're the ones trending how companies are kind of behaving and acting and understanding if any new risks are just generally in play in the market, and if any new rules need to be introduced or changed to address those. As I talked about before, each company implements SOPs based on their specific medical device and the risks associated with how their product gets used. The quality team is generally the team that is the expert in understanding the standards and the regulations and the types of risks in the market that kind of feed into the external parties. So they're the ones making sure that the SOPs align with all of that. But it is actually everyone's responsibility within the company to follow the SOPs and make sure that they are doing work in compliance with all of these standards. And then we have auditors. So you have internal auditors who are within the company who double check that the SOPs match the standard and double check that everyone is following them. And they're kind of referred to as fresh eyes a lot of the time because they're not people who are involved in the day-to-day on that specific process that they're auditing, so they can just step back and not make the same type of assumptions. And then you have external auditors. So these are third parties that come and inspect your QMS, and then they issue your certification to say, yes, you are ISO 13485 compliant. They report back to other regulatory bodies like the FDA to say, these weren't the findings we found. And so there's coordination there as well. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about the design and development quality requirements and some of the business purposes behind these as well. So I really, really wish any design and development process I had ever worked in or been involved in was this straightforward, where you are defining your product requirements, you're actually doing your engineering, you're doing the development, you go into your testing, so that's where you do your design verification and validation, and then you transfer to manufacturing. This is the nicest, most ideal flow chart that will basically never happen. But as we talk about it from a QMS perspective, I'm going to break down what happens in terms of quality requirements from a high level again for each of these sections. So in terms of defining product requirements, what you're really trying to drive here is understanding what your product is trying to do. So the QMS system will tell you, you need to identify your clinical use case and the benefit of the product. You need to be able to link your use case with your user requirements and your product specifications, and you need to identify your clinical risks and your project tasks. So the reasons all of those that come together is basically saying we need documented requirements and understanding of what it is this product is going to do and how do we know that it's going to work. So when we're talking about defining user requirements, if we've got an imaging device, your user requirement might say, I want to image this type of tissue. And your product specification then is built on that and says, well, in order to do that, I need to use a light wave that has a light signal that has a wavelength within this range, and kind of building upon that. So that's where you are defining basically what your product is going to look like. And that becomes really the foundation for everything else that you do and how you build upon that. So as you are looking to develop your product, you're coming back to, does this meet my product specifications? Does it have that wavelength that we talked about? Does that wavelength actually image that type of tissue that I'm trying to image? And that all of that comes together during the entire design and development phase, but also when you're in manufacturing and when you're in the field and when you're looking to make changes to a specific product. Identifying clinical risks is incredibly important because, as I mentioned before, QMS is really based around the risk of your specific product, and you have to understand the risks to your clinical patients and your clinical users in order to be able to design and mitigate against them. And so knowing that upfront is a great starting point, but it will evolve as you go through each of the design phases. And then you also need to identify your project tasks. So that seems a little bit out of requirements in terms of like what we just talked about in terms of product requirements and everything being sort of clinical and product focused. But your project tasks are, what are you going to do? What is the key milestones that you're going to hit? What are the tasks that need to be done? And that is a requirement of your QMS as well. So if we talk about the business purposes for why all of this exists, well, one is a lot of us on this call are engineers, and we can probably design until perfection, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll actually ever get to market. So understanding what is a minimally viable product, so something that is actually ready to go to market based on your user requirements, your product specifications, is a good point to understand. Great, this design development work is done. Yes, there's possible for iterations, but let's get to market. It also creates a lot of team alignment. So in terms of what is the product, what is the purpose of the product, that ties together as well. And team alignment on tasks and deliverables in terms of making sure you have the right resources and just general project management. So the next, we're going to talk about just the development phase. So the development phase is where a lot of the fun engineering R&D work happens. This is where you are actually doing the design. You're trying to figure out how do you meet those user requirements, those product specifications. How does it tie together? And what you're really doing here is you're going to, as you're going through this, you're going to continue to identify more potential risks to the patient or to the user that will come up, and you're going to figure out ways to mitigate against them. And this is really a cyclical process because as a risk comes up, you will need to make a design change to mitigate against it, which may impact another subsystem that you're working on, and it all kind of pulls together. From a QMS perspective, you're going to have to document those design decisions, especially when there are trade-offs between one subsystem and another and how they function together. And you're going to have to provide evidence for who approved decisions. So that's not just design decisions in terms of those trade-offs, but even the specifications of a specific part or a drawing, all of those things that requires evidence of approval. From a business perspective, one of the things that the QMS helps you do in this phase is prioritize your actions and your decisions based on patient and user risk. So again, going back to like that purpose of why a QMS and why these standards and regulations even exist is to not hurt anybody. A business should be aligned with that and prioritizing actions related to that. A lot of this also creates a historical reference to why decisions are made, and that helps with a lot of knowledge transfer and onboarding to new team members, or as you get to later phases in terms of transferring to manufacturing. It also helps to kind of spread institutional knowledge that might be within one team to a lot of other teams. That said, too much documentation from this perspective is almost the exact same as having no documentation, because if you don't know where to look, or you have to read through 300 pages to understand a simple decision, or to kind of get to that quick decision that was made, then that's a trade-off as well. So that's something where businesses should be looking to that trade-off and seeing how they can structure their reports and their documentation in order to have everything documented, but know where to go to find things. And that can be done through a variety of ways, depending on the company itself and systems that they have in place. Okay, so ideally your requirements are set, your development is done, and now you're into your testing phase. I have never seen V&V ever go smoothly. Nobody does it once and is just done. There's always surprises. So from a quality system, what we're looking for is to make sure that you have documented procedures that you're actually going to execute, and then you execute them and you're discussing the results. And so verification and validation are the two terms that are often used for this. And at the design phase, what you're doing in verification is you're saying you have built what you intended to build. So this generally means that you're meeting your product specifications. So if you intended to build a system that outputs a wavelength of 1300 nanometers, then you check that your system actually builds, that actually outputs that wavelength. On the flip side, validation is, did you actually solve the clinical need that you were trying to solve? So does that wavelength actually image the tissue and get you the right images for your clinician to make a diagnosis on, if that's what your intended use is? So what you're doing here is you're defining test protocols for how to do this, and then you're outputting and writing reports that show that you meet your product requirements. All of this ties back to that first phase in the design and development, in the defining your product requirements of basically what it's often referred to as creating a traceability matrix of your requirements and how you test it to show that it's valid and that your product meets it. From a business purpose, you're really learning, does your product work for your customer? And that is important when you go to actually sell to your customers. But also, because none of this goes smoothly, you're really starting to learn and understand the limits and the boundaries of your design, and how that ties into what you can and cannot change as you try and move into manufacturing or scale or potentially cost down, which are generally later phases in a product's life cycle. Okay, so I'll talk about records for a second. Anytime I've talked about needing to document something or approve something or needing evidence of meeting a requirement, all of that comes down into basically documentation and records. And so in the design and development phase, there's two main files structures that exist to support this. And these are required by the quality standards. So the first is the design history file, so often referred to as a DHF. Your DHF is basically your collection of all of your requirements, your decisions, your risks, everything that was decided upon in order to say, hey, this is going to be our final product. All of the things that go into how to make your final product is really your DMR. So if I think about it from the reverse perspective, your DMR being your device master record, that's basically your recipe, your blueprint for how to actually create that device that you want to. And then your DHF, your design history file, is the documentation that says, yeah, this is the device that we actually want to make. This is the one that we want to put onto the market. So those two things are very, very key and very critical. And generally will always get looked at in an audit, and creates a lot of traceability and documentation needs as well. But those really go to support why your product should be on the market and why it should be designed the way that it is. From a business perspective, it gives you having all of these records gives you that ability to look back and build on previous testing and understand the limits of what you've designed. So a lot of what we've talked about already, but the DMR is also really key to know what you're building in production. So as you're going through your design and development phase and you're creating drawings or you're writing work instructions for your production systems, well, those are going to be used as in production, and those are going to be used in a way that they're really unchangeable or immutable in that sense. And that's why it's really important in the design and development phase to be testing the boundaries of those and knowing, well, if I'm going to set a tolerance on this part, then this is the tolerance that I should set, and no, it shouldn't be 1 centimeter more or 1 centimeter less, because this is going to be the impact of that. So a lot of that comes into play there. The last part of this is in terms of CAPA complaints and non-conformance investigations. So CAPAs are corrective and preventive actions. Complaints are when there's an issue in the field. A non-conformance is when there is an issue in manufacturing. And all of these come up because as much as we'd like to say that everything will always go right, like in the flow chart I showed before, and there's going to be one in a couple slides as well, shows everything in a nice forward linear fashion, nothing ever is. And so when things go wrong or things don't go according to plan, you are expected to look into it and see why. And so a lot of these records help to support that investigation to then drive actions for improvement forward. Okay, so I'm going to talk about change control for a second. I will say that most companies struggle with this, both in terms of a compliance perspective, as well as in terms of just having effective and efficient processes that drive this. And so one of the things I just want to talk about is this image on the left. So it is a lot easier to make changes to a product the earlier it is in the product life cycle. So if you're still defining requirements, if you're still in design and development, it's a lot easier to make changes then, because things aren't set, things aren't fixed. Things are definitely a lot more fluid. But as you get into testing, and especially once you've finished your testing and your validation, then making a change becomes a lot more intensive, and it costs a lot more to make it. So I'll talk about why as we go through the quality requirements, but this actually applies to every project. The graph I've taken on the left is just a general project management graph. It's not even medtech specific. But it generally applies to kind of everything where changes are easier to make earlier on in the process as opposed to later when some decisions have already been made. So from a quality management system perspective, there's several requirements that tie into this. So first, if you are going to make a change, and I'm going to assume that we're talking about this after verification and validation has been completed, you have to be reviewing the impact to the product requirements and to the risk. And so everything, if you're making a change, are you introducing risks to your patient? Are you changing one of your requirements? And part of that is understanding why you're making the change. So there is a regulatory requirement that if you've already submitted your regulatory, submitted for regulatory approvals, that if you're making the change, you have to, with the FDA, tell them or document why the change is necessary. But also you have to look back and say, like, why is this change necessary? And is this necessary to actually implement on all of the things I've already built? So especially if you've already launched to manufacturing or you've kicked things off with your suppliers, and now you want to change, you want to make a revision to a part, even if you just want to open up, if you want to narrow tolerances so that they're smaller, well, then what happens to parts that were already made where the manufacturer is able to make them with a larger tolerance? Are you able to accept them or not? And if you accept them, well, what does that mean for your product and potentially introducing risks to your patient? And you also have to consider your impact to interfacing assemblies. So again, in that tolerance, that very mechanical example, if you're interfacing two parts together, you change one tolerance, will it impact another? Does it impact your work instructions or your processes? Does that part interface with other equipment that now needs to change or be modified, or you need a different type of equipment to use? And then one of the things that was introduced more recently, and I say that as in like the last 5 years, is, are there similar products that are affected by this change? So you might have multiple products on the market and you might be changing product A, but you should actually also go and make this change on product B as well, because it will make product B better too. And so tying all of that together becomes really important. And all of that just kind of goes into, supporting that this change is needed and the scope of the change. But also what's important is that you've now gone and you've done any re-verification or revalidation to show that this change is still acceptable for use in this product, and it still meets all of your product requirements or your user requirements as well. You need to make sure that people are trained to the change. So especially if people were trained to the original processes, now you're going to go and you're going to change something. So who needs to be aware of the change? Who needs to execute differently or do things differently? And then you also need to make sure that your change is approved by the same people who approved your original change. So generally this is a cross-functional review. So it might seem very simple that you are narrowing tolerances on a part, and so that maybe should just be a quick engineering sign-off, but that's not generally the case. And so you're looking for cross-functional review, and typically with an engineering change like that, it's engineering, manufacturing, quality all need to be involved, but in many times it also involves regulatory, purchasing, supply chain, material handling. It can expand depending on kind of the scope and the roles within the company. From a business perspective, a lot of the things in terms of what we're considering from a quality system perspective is important, but it also adds in just this cross-functional awareness of changes and the ability to plan for upcoming changes. So this is actually where I see a lot of companies struggling with in terms of changes happening in a little bit of a silo and a bit of a bubble, and making sure that there's enough awareness that this is coming. Particularly if you're in manufacturing, then you need to be looking at how do you disposition parts that were already approved or product that might already be in the field if there needs to be a change that is impacting those. So I spent a lot of time on that. I could also spend a lot of time on actually transferring to manufacturing, but I'm not going to. I'm going to just spend only a minute or so on this. But when we're talking about transferring to manufacturing, you're really looking at processes, equipment, internal testing requirements. How do you know that your processes are actually going to build you good product, that you have suppliers, that you have people on site to build, or maybe you've outsourced all of your manufacturing, but basically that all of those facilities are set up. And those are kind of key quality requirements. And one of the major business purposes for why I can spend a lot of time talking about this is, at the end of the day, you need to transfer a product in a full device master record, so a DMR with all of those blueprints and the recipes for what to actually build into manufacturing, so that you can actually consistently build good product. That is the goal. If there are a lot of loopholes in the QMS, I actually wouldn't call them loopholes, but sorry, there's a lot of allowances in the QMS that permit you to kind of move processes into manufacturing that don't always build good product, but it's okay as long as the bad product doesn't go out to the field. So if I come back to that, like, don't hurt patients, don't hurt clinicians, purpose of a QMS, that's really the goal of it. But the business goal of a transfer to manufacturing and doing all of these things is to actually make sure that if we say we're going to build 50 products next quarter, then we can actually build 50 products next quarter. And so then sales can go and sell those 50 products. And as a whole, that makes our company kind of work a lot better. And the second aspect of it is, in terms of putting all of this on paper and putting all of this into your device master record, is you don't want to end up with production processes that require a lot of institutional knowledge to build. So that's knowledge that lives in the head of the design engineers who, built this a couple times and are ready to go, but then the work instructions are lacking a lot of the details that they kind of just assumed and put it together. So that's where fresh eyes are really important in executing on this stuff. So I'm going to talk about the manufacturing aspect, and just given time, I'm going to only spend a few minutes on this, about 5 minutes total, and then I'll go to general QMS requirements, and then we can move to questions. So this is just kind of like the key processes that happen in manufacturing. You have supplier selection, you have purchasing of materials, incoming inspection, so making sure your materials are good, material handling, assembly and testing, and then possibly sterilization. And at any point in this, you might actually have third parties involved doing some of this work, or you might do it all yourself from incoming inspection onwards. So one of the things that comes up a lot is in terms of supplier controls and incoming inspection. And so this is once you're in manufacturing, you're purchasing your parts from the suppliers. From a quality perspective, you need to ensure that you're getting good parts, and that your supplier's quality management system is essentially an extension of your own. So what that is meaning is, from a business perspective, if something goes wrong in the field, or if a patient gets injured, or your parts don't work, even if it's your supplier's fault, it ends up being your fault, or you end up having the liability and the responsibility for that, to the regulatory bodies, to the patient, and so on. And so having control on your suppliers is important from that perspective. Now, one of the things that often comes up is, how much do I need to control my suppliers, and which suppliers? And so most often, you'll end up with a risk matrix where you have high risk suppliers, medium risk, low risks, and that risk is based on the risk of the product that they're providing. So it's not risk of the actual supplier, but it's the risk of the product that they're providing. Please begin scanning. Being good or being bad, and that kind of all ties together. So one of the ways we control that is through checking the supplier controls, their quality management system. Is their production processes, are they validated? Are they good? Do they have outgoing inspection? And then the other aspect that we tie to that is inspecting parts once we receive them in our facility, to make sure that they are good, and that they pass and they ensure performance. From a business perspective, all of that is important, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that our inventory that we have in-house in our manufacturing facility is good and is ready to use. And if it's not, then somebody is going to go and they're going to try and build, and they're going to end up with bad parts. They're going to end up building bad product. maybe it's not going to go out the door, but they just wasted a lot of time and a lot of money trying to build something that they couldn't, and now they don't hit a delivery date. So kind of that importance kind of cascades down. From a material handling perspective, it's really important to know what inventory you do have on site, what is good and available to use, and identifying the different parts and the different revisions so that there's no mix-up. All of that's really key from a QMS perspective. From a business perspective, that's also really important to know where your inventory is and how much you have, so that your procurement team or your supply chain team is going ahead and purchasing before you run out, so that if you're trying to build something, you actually have the materials available to build. So non-conforming material is basically material that doesn't match your drawings. And that can be purchased from a supplier, or that could be you built something and now the final assembly or sub-assembly doesn't work, or you couldn't build as you planned. From a QMS perspective, this is what a lot of standards and regulations are really worried about. They want to make sure that you don't send bad product to the field. Again, the whole concept is bad product causes harm, and we're not harming patients, we're not harming clinicians. So all of this is about segregating it. You want to make sure you don't distribute it to customers. So that's something auditors will always look at. And then you want to be investigating the root cause of the nonconformance and actioning on any of the other products affected. From a business perspective, you definitely want to do all of these things because you want to stop building bad product. You want to actually take this a step further and implement, whichever design or process or equipment changes you might need to prevent this from happening again. And a lot of times metrics around nonconformances are collected, and that really should be used to action, what has the highest rate of failures, or the highest risks associated with failures, and kind of looking at those together to really use your team and your resources wisely and tackle those things first, not really the one-off failures. Especially if you are a smaller team or a smaller company that are scaling, your resources are probably limited. But even in large companies, like, resources aren't unlimited and you can't do everything. So this is really what you need to be doing to prioritize how your team spends their time. Okay. So manufacturing records, a lot of this comes down to that second requirement of why our QMS exists of, if somebody does get hurt, you have to be able to respond really quickly. So understanding what got built, how it got built, who built it, what part they used, what lot those screws came from, driving all of that down really gets compiled into your device history record. And that's why all of that traceability exists, is it really helps to respond in the event of like an adverse event or a recall. That documentation is generally reviewed before it goes out into the field, and basically saying that this product is good to actually go. From a business perspective, you want to make sure that these exist, that they are there to support if something goes wrong. So it really ties into that. But it can also be used to support nonconformances or capital investigations. So even internal things that didn't make it out into the field, but could be improved upon. This information also becomes really important for if you're trying to track the configuration of products that are in manufacturing or in the field, so that if you are making a change to a product and let's say that product, that change only affects products of a specific, that have a specific software configuration on them, well, now you can go into your device history record and say, yes, these were the 400 serial numbers that are affected, and we'll roll out a remote update to these, and these are the other 800 that are not affected, and we don't need to push an update towards those. And so those types of things become important for kind of linking back to change control and inventory disposition. Okay, just a couple of more things I want to cover on just general quality management system, and then I'll open it up to Q&A. So I talked a bit about adverse events and when things go wrong. This ties a lot into complaint handling as well. And so what a complaint is when a customer calls you and says, my product's not working. The first thing that really needs to happen is an immediate review of this complaint to say, is it a safety issue, or and is it a safety issue that actually makes it an adverse or reportable event in terms of, do I need to notify the FDA or the Health Canada or whichever regulatory body or whichever regulatory jurisdiction you're in, and then kind of the cascading actions that come from that. But also the team needs to be able to investigate the root cause, action accordingly. So a lot similar to a non-conformance, and when that happens, if there's changes that happen to a product that's in the field, then they need to create those records, maintain them. That feeds into the DHR as well. And you know, if it is a true non-conformance in the field that has a risk associated with it, well, then they need to stop that product from being used in the field. So that might mean it's a recall. If they're pulling it out of the field, they're sending someone there to physically lock up the power supply so that it can't be plugged in or used. There's a lot of ways to do that. From a business perspective, collecting this information and triaging it and understanding the data behind it can actually be used to kind of get a lot of really good customer insights and needs that can make your product better and more marketable. So if you can understand how your product is being used, not necessarily customers saying like, hey, this button's not working, but more like, hey, we wish we had a feature request for this, a feature for this, and we want to kind of build upon that. So a lot of that ties into play there and kind of keeps your customers satisfied with how you are working with them and how you're responding to them as well. We talked about corrective and preventive actions very briefly, but this is when, you know, things don't go right, and it is due to a systemic issue. So one of the things I've noticed with companies as they scale, CAPAs become more and more prevalent in terms of they happen because there's cracks in the system where things kind of fall through. And so when I think back to that company that I was talking about earlier where I worked, and you know, the QMS that worked for 8 people didn't work for 20 people, well, it's because those cracks really started to stretch and show a lot more. So from a business perspective, a lot of these that are sort of one-offs but could happen again as you go and you scale and the company grows, they're going to happen more and more. And so they should be a target for fixing and resolving and supporting the growth and the scale of a company. The last thing I'm going to mention is just on management involvement and data review. So the quality management system requires executive and senior management being involved in the review of sort of key KPIs, key performance indicators coming from the processes themselves and coming as an output to that. But from a business perspective, this is really where you can start to take that data that's coming from all of your processes from your QMS and translate it into information. And then that information can actually be acted upon, and you have full team involvement and understanding what those priorities are and really moving the company ahead together towards the similar objectives, as opposed to having your QA team kind of just working in a silo, because that doesn't really drive anything forward. All right, so I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you very much for that time, and I will open it up to questions.